They have the world on the brink of disaster.
This situation is very serious, and we don't have very much time.
They claim to have nuclear capability.
They could sell it to a terrorist organization.
Their leader controls the minds and hearts of his people, like communist dictators from another era.
The iron fist is stronger than anything we've seen anywhere else.
It's the most successful totalitarian regime ever constructed.
Why has this once strong and independent people allowed one of the most repressive regimes to survive?
This goes with the Korean tradition of monarchical power.
How has North Korea arrived at its unique and perilous place in the world today? Kim Jong-il, absolute ruler of North Korea, is potentially the most dangerous man in power today. The man behind a virulent campaign of propaganda against the United States, Kim now claims to possess nuclear weapons and says he will use them if his regime is threatened. He rules over the most isolated nation on earth, a country the size of Mississippi, population 22 million. For years, he remained a hidden and mysterious figure. Now he has taken center stage. Yet his true intentions and nature are still open to debate.
He was portrayed as basically a very weird kind of person that you had no idea what he was going to be like. But when I met him, he was actually quite charming.
He may not have a balanced personality. Sometimes he's very, very reckless, and sometimes he's very calm. But he's quite bright and almost brilliant in his thinking.
He's nobody's fool, but he's apparently a very quixotic, compulsive, rather rash man. That aspect of him is worrisome. In a leader who's going to have his finger on a nuclear trigger, maybe.
The full extent of Kim's nuclear capability is still unclear. But if he actually possesses atomic weapons or the materials to make them, the threat reaches well beyond the region.
North Korea is ready to sell nuclear missile, nuclear weapons to any buyer at reasonable prices.
You can't stop a handful of plutonium, which is all it takes to make a bomb, a sort of grapefruit-sized lump, from getting out of North Korea. One of the things I fear about a nuclear North Korea is that it will sell plutonium to the likes of Osama bin Laden.
The reality of nuclear weapons in North Korea could also lead to a perilous new arms race.
Immediately, Japan will go nuclear. Then you have China will be alarmed. So no time will you have Sino-Japanese arms race. These are huge countries.
By all standards, the situation in Korea is difficult, the options limited. While the Bush administration does not rule out military action, the consequences of a second Korean War could be catastrophic.
The North Korean military is the 5th largest military in the world. It has over 1.2 million in uniform and has the ability to mobilize 2 to 3 million more. They have the largest submarine fleet in the world. They don't view using chemical weapons as a weapons of mass destruction. They see it as part of their normal doctrine.
Even without their use of missiles and unconventional weapons, an attack on North Korea could result in a devastating retaliation. Thousands of artillery rockets hidden in the hills just north of the border could reach South Korea's capital, Seoul, only 30 miles away, in under 3 minutes.
In 1994, the North Koreans said if anyone thinks they'll be contemplating an attack on North Korea, we can turn Seoul into a sea of fire.
There's no bigger threat than that. There are 12 million people in Seoul. South Korea can be reached by conventional cannon. not missiles, not nuclear bomb.
Since the invasion of Iraq, North Korean officials fear that they will be the next target of U.S. forces. But a crucial element of the American military strategy in Iraq was the expectation of support of the local population. In North Korea, this possibility is highly unlikely.
What happened in Baghdad will not happen in North Korea. North Koreans are very well indoctrinated.
Despite the enormity of their suffering over the last decade, that included a widespread famine in which more than 1 million people starved to death, the vast majority of North Koreans do not appear to hate their leader.
The level of popularity enjoyed by Kim Jong-il is unquestionable. There's no divisiveness within the system. There's no dissensions or dissident groups. It would be very difficult for us to replace the regime. Then replace with what?
Kim Jong-il has survived into the 21st century, while other old-style communist regimes are long gone. But since its inception, North Korea has always been unique among totalitarian socialist societies. What makes it different, and a key factor in Kim's survival, is his cynical exploitation of deeply rooted cultural traditions to manipulate and control the minds and hearts of his people.
The North Korean system that seems so strange to outsiders makes a lot of sense to Koreans because it fits in very well with their traditional worldview, with the history they've come out of and these notions of social hierarchy, reverence for the leader. Those are all things that are reinforced by this cultural identity.
To understand how Kim has succeeded in capitalizing on this age-old cultural identity, we must look to the history of the proud and determined people of Korea. For 1,300 years, Korea was a thriving and highly advanced civilization, living in relative peace as an independent and unified nation. But Korea's unique position in the geography of the region made it a tempting target. As the 20th century approached, Japan invaded the peninsula with the intention of conquering the mainland. Instead, they took Korea. Korea remained a colony of Japan for 35 years.
Koreans were given Japanese names. The speaking of Korean was discouraged. The eating of Korean food was derided. And when they were crossed, the Japanese could be very brutal.
The Japanese forced tens of thousands of young Korean women to work as sexual slaves, essentially, for the Japanese military, the so-called comfort women, as well as mobilizing hundreds of thousands of Koreans for forced labor in Japanese mines and factories. They imprisoned and killed thousands of Koreans who resisted. It was a policy of cultural obliteration of Korea's independent identity.
Japan is finished as a major world power.
Japan's dream of empire finally ended with their defeat in World War II. For the first time in over 50 years, Koreans saw hope for their freedom and fully expected to once again become a peaceful, independent nation. But while the United States had extensive plans for post-war Japan, it was almost totally unprepared for what to do with Korea. But Russia was prepared. Just prior to Japan's surrender, Soviet troops swept south deep into Korea. The U.S. had no forces in place to prevent them from occupying the entire peninsula and was frantic for a solution.
On August 10th, 1945, there was a meeting of senior leaders of the U.S. government. Around midnight, they sent two colonels, one of whom was Dean Rusk, our future Secretary of State, into another room with instructions to draw a line across the Korean Peninsula where the United States would divide occupation duties with the Soviet Union. Mr. Rusk said in his memoirs that he had no preparation for this task, and all he had was a National Geographic map.
There was nothing on the map to indicate a natural boundary, so they simply drew a line approximately halfway down the peninsula at the 38th parallel, just north of the capital, Seoul. In the years that followed, this arbitrary border hardened into a barrier, separating families and loved ones from each other.
This was a disastrous decision. The Koreans had no input on the country being divided. They were bitterly opposed to this. No Koreans accepted this dividing line as anything permanent, and most wanted to get rid of that line at any cost.
One man determined to reunify Korea at any cost is Kim Il-sung, the legendary father of Kim Jong-il. Chosen by Soviet Premier Joseph Stalin to lead North Korea, he will become like a god to his people. But his dream of reunifying his country will result in a devastating catastrophe. Kim Il-sung's unique position among communist dictators after World War II is rooted in his fierce independence and defiant spirit. He begins his career as a guerrilla fighter against the hated Japanese.
Kim wasn't just a Soviet stooge like some of the people that Stalin was putting into power in Eastern Europe. He was a genuine nationalist that the Koreans could respect as someone who really spent his whole life up to that point fighting the Japanese. And he did seem to have a certain charisma.
The legends of his daring do, of course, were very much used, and the cult of personality immediately began to be put in place and has continued to this day.
The systematic development of Kim's cult of personality depends primarily on a ceaseless campaign of propaganda.
It seems as if Kim Il-sung was the sole independence fighter against the Japanese. That Kim Il-sung is a military genius. That's how children are taught.
We were told that he crossed the river on a bridge of leaves, and that he threw pine cones, and they turned into grenades. We heard this over and over, and we really believed that. So naturally, we idolized him.
The idolization of Kim Il-sung goes beyond the usual barrage of half-truths and hyperbole. Kim enhances his godlike image by exploiting long-held cultural traditions rooted in Confucianism.
He developed an ideology called the Juche, that is self-reliance, which is based on Confucian civilization. It's Confucian civilization in the sense that you have the family system, and the state is an extended version of the family, and therefore the leader is a father. And North Koreans think that way about their leadership. The leadership they support because they're the parents. And they don't choose their parents. They're simply there. That's what underlies the Juche ideology.
Juche uses the kind of organic metaphor of the whole society, the state as a single body, with the head being the leadership and the people being the main body of the society, and that you can't have one without the other. People have to move as one entity.
Unlike Marxist-Leninist ideology, this is more spiritual determinism-based doctrine, which is Confucianism. When you have the will, you can move the mountains.
On June 25, 1950, Kim Il-sung launches a massive invasion of South Korea.
In Northeast Asia, the latest hotspot in the Cold War.
Almost all analysts in the United States thought that it was Joseph Stalin who told Kim Il-sung to go conquer South Korea.
Russian-controlled North Koreans with typical red disregard for international decency, invading their fellow countrymen to the south.
That was the official script. But we know today that it was the other way around. It was Kim Il-sung who asked Stalin.
Stalin didn't like this idea at first because he didn't want to provoke the Americans. He didn't want to trigger World War III over Korea, which was not that important to him compared to Europe. Eventually, Kim convinced Stalin that they could get away with this.
Kim predicts that the conquest of South Korea will take only 30 days. The war drags on for more than 3 years.
The tragedy is still vivid in my mind. I was 15 at the time. It was frightening. All houses burnt down. Rubble, block after block. Burning. Starvation. Everybody living in sheds. When I think of those days, I shrivel. I tremble.
When the ceasefire is finally declared in 1953, North Korea has gained nothing. The original border at the 38th parallel is restored. The country is still split in two. Nearly 400,000 South Koreans have died, 37,000 Americans. North Korea and its ally China have lost 1,400,000. The Soviet Union has suffered virtually no casualties.
Kim was clearly disappointed at the low level of real military backing that he got from Stalin, and that he never completely overcame.
This sense of mistrust and betrayal reinforces Kim Il-sung's philosophy of self-reliance at all costs. It will guide his actions and those of his son and successor Kim Jong-il for years to come. Beneath the smiles of Kim Il-sung and the leader of communist China, Mao Zedong, by the 1960s, tensions are brewing.
The Chinese wage what they call the Great Cultural Revolution in China, and they come to Korea and they tell Kim Il-sung that you are a bad communist, you look too fat, and you have so many palaces in the different resort areas, and how can a very frugal communist act in that fashion? Kim Il-sung don't stand for this and kick them out and recalls the ambassador from China and tell Chinese ambassador to go home. Nobody could tell North Korea what to do.
This is the environment in which Kim Il-sung's oldest son, Kim Jong-il, begins his rise to power. His rapid ascension through the ranks culminates in 1980. Kim Il-sung, known to all as Great Leader, officially designates Kim Jong-il as successor. He is now to be known as Dear Leader.
Suddenly this myth appears that Kim Jong-il was born on sacred Mount Paektu, a mythical place where the Korean people supposedly originated in the far distant past, and that at the time of his birth, in the middle of February, flowers bloomed, there was a double rainbow in the sky, and the whole world knew that a great new leader had been born.
In reality, Kim Jong-il is born in a Russian military camp in the Soviet Union on February 16, 1942. At the end of World War II, he moves with his family to Pyongyang, the new capital of North Korea. Little is known about Kim Jong-il's early life. His first job, at age 22, is in the propaganda section of the party.
He made propaganda films, he made musicals, he staged plays. So he's naturally get involved with the actresses. He's been called a playboy, and he likes the women, and he likes to drink, and all the what artists enjoy that he really enjoys.
He particularly likes certain genres of films, such as horror films, including the Friday the 13th series, Elizabeth Taylor films, and westerns.
At some stage, he decided that the actresses and actors in North Korea were not very good. And so he said, I would like to have Miss Chae, who is one of the more noted actresses in South Korea, here to make movies. And so they kidnapped her.
In 1978, Chae Yoon-hee is kidnapped by North Korean agents. When she arrives in North Korea, she is greeted by the dear leader himself.
There was a voice. Welcome to North Korea. I am Kim Jong-il. I felt I was now to be killed. I felt as if all my blood fell down to my feet.
6 months later, Miss Chae's husband, the renowned film director Shin Sang-ok, is also kidnapped. Over the next 3 years, they are forced to make films for Kim Jong-il, including a North Korean version of Godzilla.
We had money and all kinds of conveniences, but we didn't have freedom. I was 60 then. I couldn't die there.
Shin and Chae eventually escape, but the practice of kidnapping becomes an integral part of Kim's strategy for destabilizing his enemies. Between 1977 and 1983, several Japanese citizens vanish without a trace.
The North Koreans said we needed Japanese role models so that we could learn from them how to behave like Japanese and how to sound like Japanese when we spoke.
The purpose is for North Korean agents to pose as Japanese, thus providing cover and deniability while engaging in acts of sabotage against South Korea. By the mid-1980s, South Korea is the model of a modern capitalist nation. Its booming economy is a constant source of resentment to Kim, whose own economy is on the brink of disaster. Adding insult to injury, Seoul is internationally recognized as a world-class city when it is designated as host of the 1988 Olympics. Determined to intimidate participants and disrupt the Games, North Korea turns to its strategy of abduction and sabotage to perpetrate an act of terrorism, allegedly at the direction of Kim Jong-il.
Just disappeared.
In 1987, 2 North Korean agents posing as Japanese tourists plant a bomb on board a Korean Airlines flight headed to Seoul. Soon after they deplane at a stopover, the bomb explodes, killing 115 people. The capture of 25-year-old Kim Hyun-hee is a sensation. When asked why she did it, Kim Hyun-hee claims that she was brainwashed from early childhood to worship and obey the great and dear leaders of North Korea. To many, this sounds far-fetched. But to those who have experienced North Korea's system of indoctrination, it has the ring of truth.
어렸을 때 진짜 유치원 때부터 그런 걸 배워요. In kindergarten, we start learning about Kim Jong-il and Kim Il-sung's birthdays. On those days, they give candies and other gifts, and there are portraits of them. And then we bow in front of them and say, "Thank you, General Kim Il-sung." And then we take the gifts.
미국은 늑대.
As I grew up, we learned that the U.S. is the American imperialist wolf. We were taught that American missionaries came to Korea and they committed all kinds of barbarous acts. And so if somebody stole an apple, then the missionaries caught the child and then burned on his forehead the word thief with acid. So people in North Korea think Americans are cannibals. And young children, when they learn this stuff, they think it's real history.
I didn't know anything about the outside world. I thought North Korea was the best place in the whole world, a paradise.
If you are brainwashed into thinking that you are living in the world's best country and you have no alternative sources of information, then it is much more possible for the dictator to control you.
What Kim Jong-il fears most is his people getting to know the outside world. As people get to know about the outside world, he will come crashing down.
As the 1980s end, the Soviet Empire begins to crumble. Communist regimes throughout Eastern Europe are toppled. The Berlin Wall is torn down. And finally, the USSR dissolves. Yet North Korea seems impervious to this turning of the tide. In fact, Kim Il-sung uses the collapse of communism elsewhere to further rally support for his ideology of independence.
The North Koreans did not see Kim Il-sung as repressive. He was always held up as the heroic leader who was fending off these evil influences from outside, and that only by supporting him fully could the North Koreans win full independence.
Increasingly isolated in an ever more hostile world, Kim Jong-il, now head of the military, looks for options to ensure the security of his father's regime. He turns to a nuclear weapons program begun in the early 1980s. Despite Kim's denials, U.S. intelligence has confirmed its existence. It will soon lead North Korea to the brink of a full-scale war with the United States. On the morning of June 16, 1994, President Bill Clinton calls together his top advisors for what amounts to a war council. Plans for the deployment of a massive military force to South Korea are on the table. Satellite photos have revealed compelling evidence that North Korea is attempting to build a nuclear bomb.
We were preparing for the possibility of war in a very serious way, planning, first of all, for a strike on the nuclear complex, but secondly, for the war that could well have resulted had the North Koreans launched an invasion of South Korea. That all looked very, very real to us at the time.
The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 is the most dangerous moment the world has seen. I think 1994 is the second.
In fact, Secretary of Defense Perry was briefing President Clinton in the Oval Office on a reinforcement plan at the very moment that former President Carter, Jimmy Carter, called President Clinton from Pyongyang and said, "Hold on, I've been talking to Kim Il-sung, and maybe there's some negotiated agreement that could be reached."
President Carter has gone to Pyongyang to try to negotiate a diplomatic solution to the crisis.
It is now past midnight Friday morning in North Korea. And
he appears on CNN to announce his achievement.
President Kim Il-sung has committed himself to...
Carter saved Clinton's bacon because the Clinton administration had the idea that pressure is the only way you can deal with a problem like this. They had no understanding of North Korean psychology, which is that simply made them more determined to resist the pressure and show that they would not be cowed down by the mighty superpower.
Carter has averted a military showdown. In exchange for oil and other sources of energy and the eventual normalization of relations with the United States, the North Koreans agreed to freeze their nuclear program. But while the terms of the agreement are being negotiated, an unexpected event rocks North Korea. Kim Il-sung suddenly dies of a heart attack. The shock is felt even by those aware of his abuses who have escaped to the south.
When Kim Il-sung died, I wept. I really mourned. We couldn't believe it. He seemed immortal. Many died from excessive mourning and weeping.
I felt, okay, this is the end. We are finished. I thought we wouldn't be able to carry on without Kim Il-sung.
The new leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-il, lacks his father's charismatic command. Many predict that his government will soon collapse, but he is determined to retain power at any cost.
This is a man for whom regime survival is fundamental. And so he will do what he needs to do to stay in power in terms of the control over his people, the lack of human rights, and some of those things are quite horrific.
The national security system has been strengthened under Kim Jong-il. The political surveillance expanded. In the past, people were taken away, imprisoned with discretion, but now they just don't care. They openly pick up people and then put them in prison, and they disappear without leaving a trace.
Many disappear into a system of prison camps, hidden between the mountains near the northern border. The only known photographs of the prisons themselves are satellite pictures. These sketches were drawn by former prison guard An Myung-cha.
I was a prison guard for 8 years, and I saw brutal stuff. Think of Auschwitz during World War II. In Auschwitz, they specialized in killing people fast. In North Korea, they kill them as slowly as possible. They told me that the inmates were political criminals and disloyal, so if they attempted to escape, we could shoot them to death.
In 1994, An learns that his father has been overheard criticizing Kim Il-sung. He knows he will have to escape North Korea or face dire consequences.
I had done nothing wrong. My father was branded as a traitor, and then he was killed. My mother was also accused of being a traitor and put in prison. My brother was killed too. So I had to escape somehow, even if that meant death.
The Duman River marks the border between North Korea and China. It is patrolled by North Korean agents who often shoot to kill people trying to escape. After several attempts, An makes it safely to the other side. Others are not so fortunate. Despite the risks, by the mid-90s, an increasing number of people attempt to flee North Korea, not only because of the growing repression, but primarily because of the country's ever-deepening economic crisis.
They're in economic trouble, partly because they don't run their economy very well. But by the mid-90s, you then have a series of natural disasters, floods, etc., that lead to serious famine.
But these tragic conditions do not deter Kim from extravagant spending on his vast military forces.
He starves his people at the expense of providing for his military. 30 to 50% of the North Korean gross domestic product goes to the military.
In 1998, North Korea launched a rocket over Japan. It created a huge outcry, not only because it went over Japan, but because, unbeknownst to our analysts in advance, it turned out to be a 3-stage rocket. If that 3-stage rocket had been successful, which it was not, it fell into the sea, it very soon could have reached the continental United States.
The White House is stunned. The hope for a peaceful progression in relations has collapsed on both sides.
When North Korea made its nuclear freeze agreement with the U.S. in 1994, we got up front what we wanted. They stopped their nuclear program that could have made 30 nuclear weapons a year. in a very short time if it had not been stopped. So they felt they'd given up quite a lot. They got promises. After this agreement was concluded in 1994, the Republicans take over Congress. Clinton faces real opposition to this agreement he's just concluded. You softy, you've just given away the store to North Korea. So Clinton just didn't carry out most of this agreement. And many people in the Clinton administration thought, well, North Korea will collapse anyway. We don't have to carry it out. In the meanwhile, the military men in North Korea are going to Kim Jong-il and saying, you sucker, you've been conned.
When Kim launches his long-range missile, Clinton is compelled to rethink U.S. policy towards North Korea. Following South Korea's lead of dialogue with the North, in October 2000, the president sends his Secretary of State, Madeleine Albright, to Pyongyang for direct talks with Kim Jong-il.
I went having been briefed on what kind of a weirdo he was from our own people. He was portrayed as reclusive-like, with many girlfriends and watching porno movies, and basically a very weird kind of person that you had no idea what he was going to be like.
So, did you spend a pleasant time there?
He was actually quite charming. While I knew all the terrible things that he had done, I could at least make the distinction that he wasn't crazy. He was very, very well prepared, responded without notes, was not only respectful, but also interested in what I had to say.
The talks with Secretary Albright lead to a remarkable breakthrough.
Kim Jong-il puts his missile program on the table. He offers to end all exports of ballistic missiles. He offers to freeze the production, deployment, and testing of all ballistic missiles with a range of 300 miles or more.
This was extraordinary. It was indeed a moment of great hope. There was a possibility Kim Jong-il was finally going to enter the community of nations, perhaps hesitantly, but ultimately to really create the final peace and stability that might replace the armistice of 50 years that had been put in place at the end of the Korean War.
It was a hopeful set of cards that we left on the table. I think it was a big surprise to everybody when the Bush administration decided not to pick up that hand of cards.
The newly elected President Bush has grave concerns that Kim Jong-il cannot be trusted.
North Korea is a regime arming with missiles and weapons of mass destruction. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil.
Bush's strong words are met by an increasingly defiant Kim Jong-il. North Korea's seeming determination to become a nuclear power will lead to an ever-escalating confrontation with the United States. Fearing that he too will be targeted by precision-guided missiles, like those used against Saddam Hussein, Kim Jong-il goes into hiding for 50 days, shortly before the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Kim's disappearance also coincides with the annual U.S.-South Korean joint military exercises. For more than 50 years, the U.S. military has maintained a commitment to protect the South at a cost of more than $2 billion per year. 37,000 American troops are still in place and ready for combat.
If I were North Koreans, I would worry too. We know today the Americans have a 5-stage attack plan on North Korea.
They are scared of us. They've been scared of us throughout the Cold War. And now, during the Bush period, they've become really scared again.
People say, well, are you willing to talk to North Korea? Of course we are. But what this nation won't do is be blackmailed.
President Bush has stated that any direct talks prior to North Korea's halting of its nuclear program are blackmail, the rewarding of bad behavior.
If that remains the U.S. posture, I think we're headed for a train wreck. I think it will be very difficult to prevent North Korea from going ahead with a nuclear weapons program.
But many believe that Kim's true intention is to bargain away his nuclear program in exchange for normal relations with the West and a guarantee his regime will survive.
Deep down, the honest feeling on the part of top leadership, in my assessment, is that they like to have a situation where they don't need to pursue nuclear weapons. I'm absolutely sure if we provide a security assurance, they will have an incentive to do away with their nuclear programs.
In April 2003, U.S. and North Korean officials meet in China to try to resolve the nuclear issue. The meeting ends badly, cut short when North Korea announces that they now possess atomic weapons. Though still unverified, the assertion adds new urgency to the debate within the Bush administration on how to proceed. There are no easy options.
The administration has not yet figured out what they're going to do about North Korea. If we're going to try to talk North Korea out of nuclear weapons, we have to be able to say, if you satisfy us on the nuclear weapons issue, we will otherwise leave you alone. That might not work, but that has to be phase one. If that doesn't work, then we need to move on to other options, including the military option, which we shouldn't take off the table. Stakes are too high. This is too serious a matter. We have to be able to risk war.
Short of war, a naval blockade of all goods entering and leaving North Korea is being considered. But the risks are enormous, especially to South Korea, which remains extremely vulnerable. In May 2003, North Korean officials stated, "The South will sustain an unspeakable disaster if it turns to confrontation." Ironically, the new president of South Korea, Roh Moo-hyun, is less worried about threats from Kim Jong-il than the possibility that the Bush government's hawkish policies will trigger a military strike by North Korea. President Roh was elected on a platform of engagement and cooperation with the North and eventual reunification. Kim Jong-il has stated that he too shares the goal of a reunified Korea. The question is, under what terms? A totalitarian socialist regime ruled by Kim? Those with ties to North Korea's leaders deny that that's Kim's intention.
The North Korean idea of reunification is not a socialist system. People think that Kim Jong as a socialist first. He's a national first. Yeah. His first priority is survival of the Korean nation as one nation. Yeah. That means the North and South Korea coming together under umbrella of confederation. Political, economic system are kept intact.
But for all his promising assurances, Kim has proved to be difficult to trust. His violation of agreements in the past has led to profound doubts about his true ambitions, and not only by the Bush administration. Many South Koreans are equally skeptical. Their pain-filled memories of the last time North Korea attempted to reunify the nation are deeply felt.
I always say the Korean unification will not come until the Korean War generations all die. Because it was a fratricidal war, brothers killing brothers, families killing families. Reconciliation of these people is not easy. The Korean Peninsula will be reunified someday, long after I'm gone. I think the best way is the solution by the Almighty, that the South Korean people who remember the war, they should die before the reunification can come.
Stay tuned for Page One, your first look at the front page of tomorrow's New York Times. Then, relive the early months of the Korean War, when General MacArthur's daring invasion turned the tables for American and UN troops. Our Time in Hell, the Korean War, next.